So I want you to picture the year 1304. Just put yourself there for a second.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. I want you to imagine this massive granite boulder just smashing into a stone castle wall. It instantly crushes a defender up on the ramparts. Dust and blood are just spraying everywhere into this freezing Scottish air.
It's a brutal image.
Right, but here is the twist. You don't actually hear the scream.
Oh.
No, you only hear, like, the polite clinking of wine goblets.
Right, of course.
Because you are standing inside a luxury timber cabin looking out through a custom-built glass window. And sitting right next to you is Queen Margaret of England.
Sipping her wine.
Exactly. Sipping her wine and watching this absolute carnage over lunch like it's, I don't know, a theater performance.
Which is just an incredibly jarring scene to put yourself into, you know?
It really is. And that's actually the mission of our deep dive today.
Ooh.
We're looking at the historical accounts of the Siege of Stirling Castle.
Yeah.
And we are exploring this terrifying intersection of ego, innovation, and just, well, psychological warfare.
It's a perfect framing for it. Because you have men inside that fortress who are, they're literally eating their own leather boots just to survive.
Oh, wow.
Right. While the English royal court essentially turns their slow starvation into lunchtime entertainment.
It's so dystopian.
It really is. But that single chilling detail sets the stage for everything we're going to unpack today. It perfectly reveals the mind of King Edward I.
A man who, well, spoiler alert, was ultimately willing to reject an actual white flag military surrender just to make sure his little show went on to the final curtain.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to me, looking through the sources, this wasn't just a battle, it was a lethal performance piece.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got King Edward I, right, famously known as Edward Longshanks. Now, at this point in history, he is 65 years old.
Which is ancient for a medieval king in the field.
Right. And he's ravaged by dysentery. His body is actively failing him. The sources say he has to be carried around in a litter half the time.
Yeah, he's in rough shape.
Yet he is manifesting this cold, incredibly efficient rage. I mean, how does an aging, dying king sustain that level of theatrical cruelty for months on end?
Well, to understand that, we really have to look at his core psychological motivations. And those were entirely rooted in his perception of the law.
The law?
Yeah. So Edward Longshanks was a giant for his time, literally. He was 6'2" in an era when the average man was barely 5.5 feet tall.
Which is where the name Longshanks comes from, right?
Exactly. But his true power wasn't physical intimidation. It was, well, it was legalistic maneuvering.
Yeah,
See, years earlier, Scotland went through this massive succession crisis. Their king died without a clear heir.
Right.
And the Scottish nobility actually invited Edward to step in and arbitrate their disputes, basically to pick their next king.
I mean, in hindsight, that seems like a massive miscalculation on their part.
Oh, absolutely a historic blunder, because he leveraged that invitation to maneuver himself into a legal position called the Lord Paramount of Scotland. He essentially made the Scottish nobles sign paperwork acknowledging him as their ultimate feudal superior.
So it's all on paper.
Exactly. So by the time we get to 1304 and the siege at Stirling, Edward didn't look in the mirror and see a foreign conqueror invading a sovereign nation.
What does he see?
He saw himself as a landlord dealing with violently unruly tenants.
Wow. Okay, I am trying to wrap my head around that level of control. It's almost as if, like, the world's most aggressive homeowners association was suddenly given absolute lethal military power.
That is a very good way to put it.
Like, you violated the lease, so we're bringing trebuchets. To him, this wasn't a war between two nations at all. It was just a breach of contract.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you know, that legalistic framework is precisely what made him infinitely more dangerous than a simple warlord.
How so?
Well, think about how conflicts usually work. A traditional warlord might eventually show mercy to a brave enemy out of, like, mutual respect on the battlefield.
Sure, like knightly chivalry and all that.
Yeah, exactly. But a judge doesn't respect a criminal for fighting the police.
Oh, wow.
A judge shows zero mercy. Edward wasn't trying to defeat an opposing army in a traditional sense. He was trying to execute rebels who had defied his legal right to rule.
And I guess that mindset completely explains the bizarre logistics of this siege, because the sources talk about this bureaucracy of death.
Oh, yeah?
Edward didn't just bring soldiers. He brought his entire government to the muddy trench lines outside Stirling Castle.
He really did. He practically relocated the administrative heart of England.
Which is wild.
It is. While trebuchets are pounding the basalt walls of the castle, you have royal clerks sitting in canvas tents just a few yards away, scratching out property deeds and legal writs on parchment.
So they're just doing paperwork in a war zone.
Right. The justices of the King's Bench, which is essentially the highest court in the land, they are holding actual legal court sessions within earshot of people being crushed by rocks.
Imagine trying to plead a civil case while a 200-pound boulder flies over the judge's head. It's just absurd.
It's completely surreal.
And he even banned his own starving soldiers from hunting the local deer and boar, right? He reserved all that game solely for his own table.
Yes, exactly.
Not because he could eat it all, but just to assert total, absolute legal dominance over the physical land itself.
And this legal obsession dictated the terrifyingly systematic methods he used to destroy his enemies.
Because he needed an audience for the punishment.
Exactly. If his goal was to assert his legal supremacy, the punishment had to be a spectacle. And that audience was the incredibly small group of men trapped inside Stirling.
Okay, and that brings up the craziest part of the mismatch here.
Yeah.
You would think, based on the scale of Edward's response moving his entire government to a muddy field, that there was a massive army inside this castle.
You'd assume so.
But there wasn't. Inside Stirling Castle, Sir William Oliphant was commanding a garrison of merely 30 men.
30 people.
Just 30.
And that count includes the kitchen cooks and a local monk.
Wait, a monk?
Yeah, a monk. They were not a formidable army. They were just the last holdouts remaining loyal to King John Balliol, who the English had already defeated and exiled to France.
So the rest of the country had basically given up.
Pretty much. The rest of Scotland had fallen, the great lords had surrendered, but Oliphant's oath to his exiled king was basically his entire identity.
Right.
He wasn't going to break it, even if it meant starving to death.
And this leads to an interaction that perfectly highlights Edward's mindset. Oliphant walks to the gate and respectfully asks Edward for a temporary ceasefire.
Right, a very standard medieval request.
Yeah, he doesn't even want to fight. He just asks for enough time to send a messenger to France to ask his exiled king for permission to yield.
So he doesn't break his sacred oath.
Exactly. And Edward's reply is it's brutal. He just says, if you will not surrender, you will hang.
Yeah. Edward had absolutely no interest in the bureaucracy of chivalry when it applied to people he considered traitors.
He wasn't going to grant a recess.
Not at all. Following that refusal, he immediately ordered his engineers to escalate the siege. And this is where his obsession overrides even his religion.
Oh, the lead roofs. This part is wild.
It really is. Edward sent writs to the local sheriffs with a command that completely shocked the local clergy. He ordered his men to strip the heavy lead roofs off the sacred cathedrals of St. Andrews and Dunfermline.
Which were massive holy sites.
Huge, and he literally recorded it in his financial ledgers as a forced loan from God.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. How do you reconcile that cognitive dissonance?
What do you mean?
Well, you have a divine right Christian king, someone who believes his authority to rule comes directly from God, actively sending men with crowbars to dismantle holy sanctuaries just to build weapons.
It's quite the paradox.
Right. I mean, the logistics alone, hauling massive sheets of cathedral lead for miles through the Scottish mud on wooden carts is wild. But why lead? Why not just use more rocks?
Well, because he understood the physics of medieval siege engines. And he let the science of warfare completely override his piety.
Okay, break that down for us.
So trebuchets are gravity-powered machines. To fling a massive stone, you need a heavy counterweight box on the short end of the throwing arm.
Right.
Usually you fill that box with stones and dirt. But stones and dirt are bulky. They take up a lot of space.
Sure.
Lead, however, is incredibly dense.
Right, so you can pack way more mass into a much smaller box.
Precisely. By filling the counterweight boxes with holy lead from the cathedral roofs, the box is smaller but significantly heavier.
Which changes the mechanics.
In physics terms, it falls faster and with less air resistance. That generates a much more violent, rapid whip action in the throwing arm.
Wow.
He realized that to smash his enemies, he needed peak kinetic energy, even if he had to steal God's roof to get it.
But even with all that kinetic energy, the basalt walls of Stirling Castle were incredibly stubborn.
They really were built to last.
Yeah. The sources say the lead-weighted stones were chipping the masonry, but they weren't breaking the spine of the fortress.
Right.
So Edward decides, if he can't physically break the walls, he's going to bake the defenders alive.
Yeah. When blunt force impact failed, he pivoted to chemistry.
Which sounds terrifying.
It was. He unleashed a European derivative of Greek fire. This wasn't just a regular flame. It was a viscous, sticky cocktail of pitch, animal fat, sulfur, and oil.
Oh, that sounds awful.
The English loaded clay pots of this substance into their catapults, and when it hit the castle walls and shattered, it didn't just burn, it clung to the stone, the wood, and the skin of the defenders.
It's essentially medieval napalm.
That's exactly what it is.
The sensory horror of that must have been unimaginable for you if you're trapped inside.
Yeah.
You know, you're in a stone box, you have the rotten egg stench of sulfur mixing with burning tar.
The air is turning to poison.
Exactly. You can't leave because of the English army outside,
Yeah.
but you can't stay because the walls are literally on fire.
Yeah.
And you can't just throw a bucket of water on it, right?
No, absolutely not.
Because water just spreads an oil fire.
Yeah, if you throw water on this mixture, the water sinks below the boiling oil, instantly flashes into steam, and essentially causes a massive fireball that spatters the sticky flames everywhere.
So it makes it so much worse.
Way worse. Edward was using raw materials and science to solve tactical problems. But here is the most astounding part of the historical record.
Okay.
Those 30 half-starved men inside actually managed to put the fires out.
Wait, how do you put out an unextinguishable chemical fire at 1304 if you can't use water?
They used sand and raw animal hides.
Really?
Sand! Yeah, sand works by completely smothering the fire, starting the chemical reaction of oxygen. And raw hides, meaning animal skins that had just been stripped and weren't tanned yet, are incredibly heavy and naturally saturated with moisture.
Oh, I see.
So the defenders draped these heavy, wet skins over the flames like modern fire blankets, and the blackened walls held.
That is just a superhuman level of resilience.
It really is.
You'd think, as a military commander, Edward might step back and say, okay, these 30 guys have earned a little respect.
You would think.
But no, their survival just pushes him to invent an entirely new kind of torture. And this is where I get a bit confused by his strategy, looking at the sources.
What part?
Well, the sources say he shifts his tactics and builds a tight arc of 12 medium-sized siege engines right in front of the castle. The army christens them the 12 Apostles.
Right. Yes.
But wait, if the massive lead-weighted trebuchets couldn't break the walls, why build 12 smaller ones? That feels like a step backward in engineering.
It seems counterintuitive, right? Until you realize he wasn't trying to break the walls with the apostles.
He wasn't.
No, he was trying to break the human mind. He shifted his tactics from sheer weight to sheer volume.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Up until this point, a siege involved sporadic firing. You load a trebuchet, you fire, there's a long gap of silence while a crew winches the arm back down and reloads.
Right, it takes time.
But Edward ordered the apostles to be fired in a continuous rolling barrage. As one fired, the next primed, the next loaded.
So there was never a moment of silence.
Never. It was an engineered acoustic nightmare. You have to remember that solid stone act like massive amplifiers.
Oh, jeez.
When a 90-pound rock hits the outer wall, the impact travels through the basalt foundation and vibrates up into the very soles of the defenders' feet.
That sounds nauseating.
It's a constant, low-frequency physical thud that rattles your teeth, followed immediately by the high-pitched whistle of the next incoming missile.
And Edward had thousands of men, so he could just keep this going.
Exactly. He rotated his English crews in shifts so the machines never stopped. But the 30 Scots, they had no shifts.
They are constantly awake, plugging holes in the walls, listening to this horrific drumbeat day and night.
Yeah.
We usually think of medieval warfare as just chaotic sword swinging, but this sounds exactly like modern calculated psychological torture.
It is. Sleep deprivation destroys the human mind incredibly fast. If you put yourself in the shoes of those defenders, after days of constant noise and zero sleep, the lines of reality blur.
You start to hallucinate. Shadows look like attackers. The wind sounds like scream.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how the English soldiers watching this supernatural resilience reacted.
How did they react?
The English troops sitting in the muddy camps actually started a rumor that Sir William Oliphant had made a pact with the devil.
Wow, really?
Yeah. To the common medieval soldier, dark magic was the only logical explanation for how 30 starving men could survive the chemical fire, the lead bombardment, and the continuous acoustic torture of the 12 apostles.
But Edward didn't believe in devils. He believed in engineering.
Right. The apostles, for all their noise and psychological damage, were basically like jackhammers trying to break a bank vault. They couldn't punch through the core masonry.
So they failed at actually taking the castle.
They did, and Edward, this giant, terrifying king who has brought his entire government to watch his victory, is being publicly humiliated by a rock.
So he realizes he has to transcend the known limits of military engineering entirely.
Yes.
He summons his master architect, Master James of St. George, and basically gives him a blank check.
The best siege engineer of the era.
Yeah. Edward orders the construction of a monster. In French, it was called loup de guerre, the Warwolf.
The Warwolf.
The scale of this machine is just baffling to me. It took 50 master carpenters and laborers 3 months just to build it.
3 months for one machine.
Right. They stripped the surrounding Scottish forests of their tallest oaks. When they ran out of wood, Edward ordered his own smaller siege engines dismantled just to feed the construction of this beast.
It was an unprecedented feat of medieval engineering. We were talking about a trebuchet that stood 3 to 4 stories tall.
That's the size of an office building.
Yeah. It had an 80-foot throwing arm. The counterweight box alone held 30 tons of material.
30 tons.
30 tons. It was designed to fire a single stone weighing up to 300 pounds.
So what does this all mean? We have a dying king spending massive amounts of treasury to build a wooden skyscraper just to throw a 300-pound rock at 30 starving cooks and monks.
It sounds like a joke when you put it that way, but yeah.
And the most incredible part of the Warwolf story is that it actually achieved its goal before it even fired a single shot.
That's the great irony of the Warwolf. The sheer sight of this 3-story machine slowly rising over the walls over the course of 3 months. I mean, the physics of it becoming undeniable to anyone watching.
It finally broke them.
It did. It finally broke the Scots' will. Sir William Oliphant and his emaciated men opened the gates. They walked out into no man's land to unconditionally surrender.
And this is the climax of the story. This is the moment that truly defines King Edward Longshanks for me.
Oh, absolutely.
The Scots are standing there. They're waving the white flag, giving him the castle. The siege is over. And Edward, infuriated that they're ruining the climax of his show, actively refuses the surrender.
He refuses it.
He orders them back inside the target zone. Why? Because he wanted the sensory payoff of seeing if his shiny new machine worked.
It defies all conventional military logic.
It's bonkers.
The entire goal of a siege is to capture the fortress intact, if possible. He had it. The keys were practically in his hand. But for the aging king, this was no longer about taking territory.
It was purely about ego validation.
Exactly. He treated actual human lives like test dummies in a ballistics experiment. He told the Scottish envoys their timing was inconvenient.
Inconvenient. Unbelievable.
They were sent back inside, forced to bar the doors, and had to wait for the executioner's axe to fall.
I am just reacting with sheer disbelief at the cruelty of that. It is literally like testing a modern bunker buster bomb on a city that has already surrendered just to check your targeting calibration.
It was a demonstration of absolute unchecked power. Once the Scots were forced back inside, Edward gave the order. The trigger pin was knocked out.
And there goes 30 tons.
30 tons of counterweight plummeted. The 80-foot arm whipped forward and a 300-pound stone lured through the air. When it struck the gatehouse, it didn't just break the wall. It pulverized the entire structure into a cloud of granite dust. One single shot turned the castle's strongest architectural point into gravel.
And only then, after the dust settles and his ego is completely satisfied, does he accept the surrender.
Naturally.
But he doesn't just let them go with dignity. He humiliated the 25 survivors. He made them walk out barefoot, wearing unbelted tunics with ashes sprinkled on their heads and nooses tied around their necks.
It was full theatrical humiliation.
And true to his legalistic nature, he threw Sir William Oliphant into the Tower of London to rot for treason.
So Edward left Stirling in 1304 genuinely believing he had won the grand game. He believed he had permanently crushed the Scottish rebellion through this doctrine of shock and awe.
He proved that no wall could stand against English engineering.
All right. But he died just 3 years later of dysentery in a grim marsh near the border. And his terrifying silence did not last.
No, it didn't, because Robert the Bruce eventually rises from the ashes of that rebellion.
Yeah.
And what's brilliant is the tactical pivot that happens next.
This raises a critical point about the evolution of warfare, and it's something I really want to leave you with today to think about.
Okay, what's that?
Well, consider the ultimate irony of King Edward's obsession at Stirling. By building the Warwolf, the absolute ultimate unstoppable castle-destroying machine, Edward essentially proved to the Scots that sitting inside a castle was a death sentence.
Oh, wow.
Right. Did the king's massive, cruel ego project inadvertently force the Scottish resistance to abandon the very fortresses the English relied on to control the country?
That is a massive backfire. Robert the Bruce learned the lesson of Stirling perfectly. You never fight the English in stone boxes.
Never.
He realized that against Edward's war machines, a castle wasn't a fortress, it was a trap. So Robert the Bruce actively destroyed his own castles.
Yes.
He tore down the walls himself and adopted rapid, hit-and-run guerrilla warfare in the hills and forests.
Which completely neutralized the English advantage in heavy engineering. You can't hit a mobile guerrilla army with a 3-story stationary trebuchet.
No, you can't.
In his desperate need to put on a show and prove his absolute dominance, Edward inadvertently handed Robert the Bruce the exact strategic blueprint needed to eventually defeat the English Empire.
He shattered the walls, but he accidentally let the spirit out of the box. And that spirit was no longer sitting behind a stationary target. This history is such a stark reminder for you listening. Immense resources and money and technology can break walls and enforce temporary compliance. But the human capacity to endure is an unbesiegeable force.
Very well said.
I just keep thinking about Queen Margaret, sitting behind that custom-built glass window, watching the destruction over London.
It's a spectator.
Yeah. The glass kept her safe from the noise and the blood, but it couldn't stop the consequences of what they were creating in that muddy field. Because history, eventually, always shatters the glass.